were trying to instigate disorder in the capital as a precursor to Kornilov coming, because the been torn up, so they have to get out of the trains. And while they're getting out of the trains, the workers and soldiers basically surround them, point their weapons at them, say, "Hey, we don't want to do this. Let's just talk." And they explain, "We're not the bad guys. Your generals are trying to crush the revolution. They want to come after the workers. They want to continue the war. None of the soldiers from the front want the war to continue. Everyone wants the participation in World War I to end." And when the soldiers who have been moved into the capital hear this, they're like, "Oh shit, well, we're not going to fight for the bad guys." And they immediately defect. They switch sides and they just join the workers and the soldiers movement from Petrograd. And like, that's it. The entire affair fizzles out. There's nothing else the generals can do, because it demonstrates at the end of the day that the generals and the bourgeoisie and the landowning aristocracy and all of these people who are, we're told, are always the big wigs, and they're the ones who get to control things, and they're the ones who have all the power. At the end of the day, they're just people. If the masses decide to disobey them, there's really nothing that these people can do about it. And there's nothing the generals can do, and they get arrested and put in prison, and it energizes the workers' movement. And then that's when you start to get almost a straight shot from Kornilov to October in terms of mobilization of the masses.
Absolutely beautiful overview. Thank you for that. It's such an interesting episode of history, just in general. And what's interesting is that this same, I guess, mess up from the reactionary forces seems to repeat itself over and over and again in just increasingly funny ways. It's actually one of the most fun parts of learning about the Russian Revolution, just all these strange characters that pop up, and they're either from their quasi-pagan, like proto-fascist ideas of them being the like supreme leader of whatever the fuck is happening in Russia, to the old style aristocrats who are like, well, you know what? This just proves that absolute power of the monarchy is the reason, is the way it works. We had total stability back then. Forget the fact that we lost the war to Japan, and forget the fact that we're losing 1.5 million people on the what for Russia was the Western Front, but the Eastern Front, World War One, so on and so forth. Let's move on to another general topic before we narrow it down a little bit. We discussed a bit of a few controversial episodes, particularly ones that would be considered quote-unquote controversial in liberal academia, if that could be even considered to be academia. But there's a few common misconceptions. I mean, if you're to go over layman misconceptions, you're going to be here all day, because for such a significant episode of human history, it's so understudied, relatively. I remember I was...
I wonder why.
Yeah, exactly right. Something I always found funny is that when I was first trying to improve my English many years ago, I was much younger. I would try to read American or like English resources on history, and I would get these encyclopedias in English, and they would go through various things of chapters of different civilizations in history, and there would always be a chapter on the American Revolution. But the like Russian history entirely is like 14 pages or something, and the American Revolution is a good 50 pages that they talk about, right? Just the American Revolution, not nothing else, right? And I'm like, for
which
such
is sorry, I was just gonna say, which is crazy, because as an American, it's like, if once you start to learn about the American Revolution outside of the liberal bourgeois
the mythology,
the mythology about it, you quickly realize, oh, this was just about the most reactionary revolution there's ever been. Whereas the Russian Revolution, the whole thing takes place over 8 months, but it is so theory dense. I mean, entire volumes, an entire library could be created just out of all the material for the Russian Revolution. And all you get is the Tsar was overthrown. They tried to establish a government. Everything was going fine until the Bolsheviks screwed it all up for everyone, and then the Bolsheviks went on to murder everyone. So that's bad.
Coup.
It's
nonsense. All right, but the question I was trying to that I want to get to is, what do you think are, outside of like layman misconceptions, middle of the road, like you kind of know a little about the Russian Revolution? What is the most common misconception in your perspective?
I think we've kind of alluded to it already, which is that even if you know that the Bolsheviks were what later became the Communist Party, and so they are the communists, even though they don't call themselves that until I think they make the switch in like 1918 or 1919. But anyway, even if you know that the Bolsheviks are the socialist slash communist party, our understanding in the US is so devoid of the understanding of the theory, but then also the undeniable class nature of the revolution. That's one of the things that's always fascinated me about the Russian Revolution is you could not get a better, more textbook example of class antagonisms, the contradictions inherent in capitalism, everything exploding out into the open, and what can happen when specifically the working class, although obviously in Russia they had to join forces with the peasantry just because if you don't know, the workers were only about 10% of the population in Russia during World War One, and the peasants were like 85%. So you need some union with the peasants in order to actually build a revolutionary proletariat state. But anyway, it's a textbook example of what the proletarian class can achieve when they're united in their goals and they do not allow themselves to be distracted or co-opted by adventurism or opportunism or these promises of, well, you just have to follow the proper channels. You just have to wait for the Constituent Assembly. You just have to let the government work it all out. When the people say, no, 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 we're hungry now, we're cold now, we're dying now, we're not going to wait. When you have the vanguard party that Lenin talks about and what is to be done, the Russian Revolution shows you like, yeah, this is absolutely possible. It's hard. It's not pretty all the time, but it's 100% possible. And that's why I think the Russian Revolution is simultaneously both inspiring and largely ignored, because we all know why they don't want us to know what is possible.
Beautifully put. Then let's kind of narrow it to something more specific.
Sure.
When it comes to, I guess, misconceptions. And is this one that we kind of very briefly touched on, but the misconception that there was once a constituent assembly, it was a democratic organ, and that supposedly the Bolsheviks did not win the elections and they were democratically unpopular. So by force of arms, they dissolved the Constituent Assembly and instead pushed forward their political will through the Soviets, specifically the Petrograd Soviet at the time. Walk us and the audience through that, because it's such a tightly wound, excuse the term, ball of bullshit that they that's condensed in this. But this is, for all intents and purposes, the most common understanding.
I need my teammates.
Including
I need my
across liberal
teammates.
academia, as well as in high school textbooks. This is how they present the case. I mean, in the West mostly. I mean, English language only.
Yeah.
But also like pretty internationally. I've had like plenty of young, keyword there, young, born after the Soviet Union fell apart, Russian liberals use that particular argumentation. That one, or the whole, whenever they're more, nationalistic, the whole, which I'm going to ask a question about later, the whole, it was a betrayal because we lost everything that was gained during World War One, betrayal of all the soldiers that have died, etc., etc. But yeah, that particular point, Herder, they couldn't win, quote unquote, democratically through the official channels that Daniel beautifully explained why that was no longer either an option or no longer a legitimate pursuit. They lost, so they got pissed off, so they used violent means to take over. So yeah, it's an extremely common misconception, even in my part of the world, and I think even back in a lot of Soviet republics, even to an extent.
Yeah, I think the homogeneity of liberal ideology is really impressive because instead of having like socialism with national characteristics, you have liberalism with national characteristics, but they're all just saying the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
Also, Hakeem, I love the question. I love that topic because it's the perfect example in the Russian Revolution of the phenomenon we observe today of right-wing grifters just spewing the simplest notions of bullshit in like 3 minutes, and then it takes like an hour and a half to debunk everything, because it's like I don't even know where to start telling you how wrong you are.
Yeah, exactly right.
So I will try. So the Constituent Assembly starts to become a buzz phrase shortly after the overthrow of the Tsar. The Tsar is overthrown at the end of February 1917. Again, these are old style dates. So if you look them up sometimes online, you'll see this is all happening in March by our calendar today. But that's why they call it the February Revolution. It was February in Russia at the time. So the Tsar is overthrown. And then the question becomes, okay, well, how do we form a new government? What do we do? There are a couple of complicating factors to finding an answer to this question. One, the country is still at war. Germany is still on Russia's Western Front. The Tsarist Duma kind of, through a complicated process, morphs into the provisional government. But then the workers also form spontaneously their own Soviets, not just in Petrograd and Moscow, but all over the country. So you wind up with this dual power in Russia for most of 1917, where you have the popular organs of the Soviets representing the workers and the peasants coexisting with the provisional government and more official channels. And the tension inherent in this dual power relationship is held at bay for a time by the promise of a constituent assembly. So the idea is we're going to have a grand coming together of all the sections of Russian society as soon as we can to hash out a constitution, to figure out what the laws are, what kind of government are we going to have? Are we going to be a parliamentary? Are we going to be a Republican government? Whatever. The problem is, and the problem with the idea that the Constituent Assembly was a legitimate, quote unquote, democratic institution, is that the provisional government keeps pushing back the dates the date when there's going to be a Constituent Assembly. First they say April, then they say June, then they say August, then they say September, then they say November after the October Revolution. So they just keep pushing it back and back and back, and the demands keep building up, but the government is unwilling or unable to call this assembly. So what happens after the Kornilov affair is Lenin realizes, okay, this government is on its way out. It is defunct. It needs us to protect itself from its own military, which they demonstrated in the Kornilov affair. So we now need to orient ourselves, we the Bolshevik Party, need to orient ourselves and the workers towards taking direct control, because this Constituent Assembly isn't even going to solve anything. So they effect the October Revolution on October 25th, 1917. It's actually kind of like a week-long process, but the 25th is usually when they say the October Revolution happened. And they form a new government, which is the People's Commissar, it's the Soviet of People's Commissars. So instead of ministers, they have commissars. And all of the famous names from the Bolshevik Party take up posts in this new government. And they reaffirm that, okay, there is in fact going to be an election for the Constituent Assembly on November 12th. We're still going to do that. But there are two problems. One, they just overthrew the provisional government. And in a country that has been racked by war, the economy has ground to a standstill because of it. You have political parties like the Mensheviks and the SRs disavow the Soviet government. They want nothing to do with it. They start muddying the waters. The problem with holding the Constituent Assembly elections on November 12th is that A, there's been a revolution, the provisional government has been overthrown, and now there's a Soviet government. And B, and this is a little technical, the Party of the Peasants is the SR Party, which stands for the Socialist Revolutionary Party. But throughout 1917, I don't know if we'll have time to get into this, but throughout 1917, there is a growing schism within the SR Party. And you have the right SRs and the left SRs. The right SRs basically wind up being the petty bourgeois, small land owning portion of the countryside, and the left SRs are more the poor and working peasants. But for the election on the 12th, they're using party rolls from September and October, but this is before the left SR and the right SR parties formally split from each other. So in the countryside, when you're voting for the SRs, even if you want left SRs, there are no left SRs. No one is denoted as left or right on the party rolls. So you just see SR party, I'm just going to vote for the SR party. Because of this, the SRs wind up being overly represented in the Constituent Assembly. So the election happens on the 12th. The Bolsheviks win, I think it's like 35 or 40% of the overall vote across the country, which is pretty impressive since the working class, again, is only about 10% of the population. But the SRs do have the majority. They decide to call the first session, what turns out to be the only session of the Constituent Assembly in early January in Petrograd. But what the Soviet government quickly realizes is that the Constituent Assembly is actually going to be very combative towards the Soviet government. So then they have a choice. Do we give in and try to compromise with a Constituent Assembly that is very obviously combative towards us and wants to undo everything that the revolution has already won? Or do we just kind of ignore them? And they do give the Constituent Assembly, the delegates there, they do give them opportunities to compromise. They give them a couple of conditions. They say, hey, we'll work with you on this and that, but you got to give us this. And the SRs, the right SRs that are in the Constituent Assembly, reject all of these terms. And at that point, the Bolsheviks and the left SRs realize, okay, well, this is a non-starter. This isn't going to go anywhere. So they just leave the Constituent Assembly, which leaves only the right SRs there. And what's funny is the report of what happened at this session, it only lasted about 13 hours long. Basically, after the Bolsheviks and the left SRs leave, they give orders to the guards not to violently disperse or arrest or harass any members of the Constituent Assembly. They say, just let them talk. No one's listening. What's it going to hurt? Just let them wear themselves out. And eventually they do, and they go home, and then they lock up the Constituent Assembly, like they lock the hall and they're not allowed back in, and that's kind of the end of the Constituent Assembly. Now, if you hear that story, you might think, oh, well, see, the Bolsheviks did ignore the democratic will of the people. But that's ignoring that the Constituent Assembly, as Lenin argued, was more of a liberal bourgeois institution in the revolution, and that the Soviet government represented the revolutionary proletarian institutions of the revolution. Therefore, the Soviet government is actually already a step ahead of the Constituent Assembly in terms of democratic potential. So what Lenin argues is that the Constituent Assembly represents a step backwards for the revolution. It is a liberal bourgeois democracy, which, if you've read Marx and Lenin, and I'm sure others as well, you know is a very limited type of democracy. They already have a revolutionary proletariat democracy in the Soviets. So why would we submit ourselves to the will of the Constituent Assembly? The Constituent Assembly should submit themselves to us. We are the majority, we are the people, we are the nation. They should listen to us. And when the Constituent Assembly refuses to do that, they say, okay, well then fine, you're not going to be a thing anymore. And they let everyone go home. They don't let them assemble again. And I think the greatest proof that Lenin is correct in his assessment is that there was not a single outcry except from the petty bourgeois and landowners about the Constituent Assembly being disbanded. The workers, the peasants, the soldiers, nobody cared. It was only the people who realized that if we don't have the Constituent Assembly, we don't actually have any access to political power anymore. They were the ones who were angry, but they were the ones who also refused to work with the new revolutionary government. So you made your bed, now you gotta lie in it.
I love it. I love it. Beautiful, beautiful overview of a very complicated episode of history. Not because it's necessarily difficult to understand, but just because you have to give so much background information. And that's why it's so easy to just be like, oh no, well, there was this democratic organ and the Bolsheviks shut it down, so that means that they were undemocratic. Which, funnily enough, by the way, the vast majority of quote-unquote democratic and free elections in the United States, particularly small-town elections, there's one person on the ballot. Otherwise, if there are two people on the ballot, it's from the one capitalist party or the other capitalist party, both wildly unpopular, reaching all the way to the presidency, where the political system is so illegitimate and so unpopular that nearly half, and sometimes even more than half, of the American population chooses not to even vote.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Every election, if it didn't vote, was on the ballot, didn't vote, would win. Like no confidence would win every time.
Exactly right. It's the same
I mean,
thing,
it
right?
does win. We typically get only like what? I think in 2020, the presidential election, everyone was in awe at the voter turnout, and it was like 70%.
Yeah.
And it was only that because everyone was stuck at home and had mail-in ballots. Like, if everything had been going along as normal, I doubt you would have gotten 50% of the people to come out and vote, because, like, who cares? Both of these guys suck.
Yep.
66% it was. In
2020.
1970. 66%.
We did it.
In 2020.
2/3.
Like an
USA.
absolute joke.
USA.
It's even worse now. Like in Iraq, it's like 32%, 30%.
Wow.
And even those numbers are jacked up and false, surely.
To give like a slight context or whatever, just for people to be able to imagine what the difference is between you establishing a new system and saying this is the way things are going to be run now by the will of the people, and then somebody trying to interject themselves in the new system that you've managed to develop and try to pull things back. I'll give the most American context ever, for example. Imagine, the American Revolution passes. And now they're setting up Congress, they're setting up, the whole American system of governance of an independent United States, of all of the colonies. But 20 million British royalists there with a lot more money than almost everybody around them in that particular part of the United States. So they utilize their political power in order to buy up a lot of patriotic, non-British Americans, unify with them, etc., in a broader, for example, I don't know, Farmers Party, etc., a lot of people that start going to the ballots that want to vote for the proper American Farmers Party don't know just how interconnected they are with the British holdouts. They get into the parliament with a very strong number, and now, for some reason, after having won their revolution, obviously these are two different revolutions, but I'm trying to get contextualize. So now, after the Americans have won their independence from Britain, all of a sudden you have a bunch of hardcore loyalists to Britain that are going to literally get instructions from London on how the United States is supposed to be governed inside of Congress. What the fuck do you think the American revolutionaries are going to do? No, fuck you. The fuck, we don't have to do this. Fuck off, because you want to take us back
on the one
to
thing that unites them. Enslaving.
Okay, but let me give my allegory, like,
know,
so that it's understandable, right? So people could argue, oh my God, but that's undemocratic because there's still those 20 million holdouts, and they deserve their place in the fucking thing. But that's not how system building works. That is not how a fight for an alternative to what came before is solidified. That is not how a revolution is defended. Nothing would change ever throughout the history of humankind if you allowed the guys that used to fucking step on your neck for like 1,000 fucking years to then just waltz, literally like the fucking Spanish
Waltz,
dance. What
yeah.
was it? Waltz, thank you. No, that's an Austrian. That's fuck. Is it Spanish?
No, it is to waltz.
Yeah.
To waltz. Apologies to all waltz lovers. Waltz back into power. No, why would I do this? Right?
Yeah.
And the Soviets even gave them, as much. The Bolsheviks gave them as much leeway as one would when they know that they hold the will of the people. But they rejected. Okay, you reject. We lock the doors. Eat my ass. Yeah.
In the Soviet government, by the way, RSFSR that then became the Soviet Union, it took one generation for former capitalists and aristocrats and white officers and all these people to get the right to vote again. It took people of African heritage in the United States 400 years to be
Yeah.
given the right to vote, and even then they're systematically excluded at every point, regardless of the point of revolution, right? After a revolution, there's some people who are systematically excluded from elections, for example. Oh, this may be undemocratic in a person who is, I dare say, stupid for their fetishization of liberal democracy. Think about it like this. After Nazi Germany fell, right, denazification needs to happen. A lot of these former Nazis should not be given the right to vote in quote-unquote free and fair elections, as much as such a thing could exist, which is arguable. But that's not what happened in West Germany. No, they didn't even bar them the right to vote. They just like grandfathered them into positions of political power,
Yeah.
from the military to like local mayoral offices, all the way to the top of the government.
They just joined different parties, but were allowed to re-enter the government in
Yeah,
whatever way
absolutely.
they wanted to. Yeah.
Just fresh coat of paint.
Yeah, all the talk about power and everything reminds me of both Mao's aphorism. It's a revolution, not a dinner party.
Exactly
Stupid.
right. Yeah,
Like,
Yeah.
like you're not. This isn't going to be pretty. We're not going to be nice about it. And then also, obviously, Engels's On Authority essay, which he lays out, like, look, the bourgeoisie does this to us all the time, even today in 2025. There is a communist party in the United States, and they are barred from running for elections.
Yeah.
Like, this is how political power works. And I think, at least in America and probably elsewhere, I think the way that the kind of the liberal ideology has been so effective is in convincing people that that's not how politics work. Politics are supposed to be civil. You're supposed to vote, and then if you lose the vote, you accept it and you organize for next time. And you're not supposed to go out on the streets. You're not supposed to actually exercise all means of your power or authority. You're supposed to be nice about it. But then as soon as the liberals start to lose ground, as soon as the socialists start to gain ground, they immediately turn to the right. They run to the fascists. I mean, don't get me started on the joke that is the Democratic opposition right now in the United States to Trump. I mean, that's, I think the reason the Bolsheviks get